PAX West, how's everybody doing? Awesome PAX. How could you not, right? This con, we come to it every year. We love it so much. Amazing community, so many great things to do. And you're spending an hour of it hanging out here with us. We don't take that lightly. That's a really big deal. We appreciate it. We're going to do our best to make it worth your while. Let me introduce us to you real quick. I'm Aaron Suduko. I'm the founder and chief video game analyst of With the Terrible Fate. I'm here with my dear friend and colleague, Dan Hughes, video game analyst, also the series runner for his podcast on Pokemon, which he's been doing for the site, a retrospective called Pokemon Rose. Anyone heard of With the Terrible Fate before by any chance? Okay, all right. There you go, dope, fantastic, it's great to see you back. All right, we have a repeat customer. That's how you know we say at least something worth listening to. It's okay if you haven't heard of us. We are a small but very passionate volunteer online publication dedicated just to studying and analyzing the storytelling of our favorite medium, video games, trying to better understand and appreciate how these stories work, why they're so cool, and why we keep coming back to them again and again. That's the one thing we do. We mostly do it in long-form written content on withtheterriblefate.com. We also have podcasts such as Dan's, we do streams, and we give lectures at conventions such as this, which is always one of our favorite things to do, because as fun as it is to play these games and publish about them, one of the most fun things for us is to get down and talk with other real gamers about why they love these games, why they're so cool, and communities like PAX are fantastic for this. So that's what we're going to be doing today, talking about Pokemon, JRPGs, some stuff about genre, maybe some other games, and a lot of other things in between. Let me give you a little bit of a housekeeping roadmap for how we're going to do that. We're going to be having a conversation up here for the hour of the panel, but as I said, one of our favorite things about this is being able to have the conversation with you afterwards. So if you do want to chat about it, we would love to do that. We'll just ask that after we're done, we leave the room so that the next panel can get ready in a timely fashion. We're going to be hanging out by the elevators on the other side of this floor, so feel free to give us a minute to clear out and then chat with us afterwards if you want. Also, we are excited to be talking about a range of games between Pokemon and JRPGs. We've got a lot of ground to cover and a lot of games to celebrate. But we know that people are mindful of spoilers too, and we want to respect that. So just so you know, and so you don't say afterwards we didn't warn you, we're going to be talking all about Pokemon, including and especially Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. We're also going to be talking about the Final Fantasy games, including digging into Final Fantasy 16, and also thinking about Final Fantasies 10 and 6. And we're going to be spending time talking and thinking about Bandai Namco's Tales JRPGs, especially Tales of Arise, some Tales of Symphonia, Vesperia, and Tales of the Abyss. It's more ground than we usually cover. We're excited about it. We hope you are too, but spoiler warnings abound for all of those. Enough of that, though. Let's talk about what it is that we are doing here. We're thinking about Pokemon, but we're also more broadly thinking about genre, because I don't know about you all, but as Dan and I have gotten older and continue to play games and think about our overall experiences with them, it can sometimes be hard to adjudicate all of these different games that we're playing and get a through line of what it is that draws us to particular games, what our libraries look like, and what it is that they say about us. And if we're not playing all of the same games, I might be interested in knowing, hey Dan, what are you up to? What kind of games are you playing? And how can I square those experiences with my own? Thinking about genres in terms of types of game and just categories to put those experiences into can, in theory, you would hope, be a useful way of starting those conversations. But a funny thing kind of happens that we've experienced, and maybe you have as well, where sometimes if you start a conversation about genre, whether that's a JRPG, or a Souls-like, or a horror game, it can quickly devolve into more of a theoretical argument about the nature or the right way to delineate the genre, rather than any of those experiences that you want to dig into in the first place. So one minute I might be saying, hey Dan, I'm really interested in thinking about this, that, or the other Souls-like, and maybe Dan will suddenly be saying, oh, that doesn't really count as a Souls-like, because a Souls-like has to have X, Y, and Z, and that's not really what's going on here. And if we start arguing about that, you might worry that we're missing the point, and you might worry that genre is something that is distracting us from the experiences that we wanted a way to celebrate and dig into in the first place. But the more we were thinking about it, and the more that I was reflecting on it, Dan, I felt like, in fact, a lot of our friendship and the way that we've come to know not just games, but also each other, can be explained in terms of genre in a way that suggests, at least at first glance, genre could be useful. Like one of the experiences that I had in high school coming up and thinking about video games that inspired me to think about their literary value specifically was we went to high school together, and I had the benefit of being able to sit for a presentation that you did lecturing about basically how to fit Ocarina of Time into a specific genre, namely what you might call the literary genre of the hero's journey or monomyth. And that was fantastic for me, not only because it was a cool way to invite non-gamers into the conversation as to why these games might be interesting to look at, say, in an English class, right alongside books and films and things like that, but also because it led me to realize, hey, here's another guy like me who's interested in the literary value of these games. Maybe we can use this genre comparison as a way into having more of these conversations with each other.
Well, speaking of those presentations, after I did that one, the year later, you did a presentation on a bunch of different games, including Nier. And what I found so special about this is that you were looking at it from a lens of, okay, this is a role-playing game, but what does it mean to take on a role? How does it make us think about the world around us and the role that we take when we're engaging with a story like Nier? But I think more special than that was that I got some insight into what you find important, namely thinking about these things in a kind of philosophical way. But then when I started thinking about why you found it important, I found that there was something really special about Nier Gestalt especially, where I realized that something that I appreciate in storytelling is this kind of father-daughter relationship that's explored through this game. So when we looked at these from the lens of genre and our own experiences, we got to know each other better and ourselves better.
Yeah, to this day, I think I really wouldn't have otherwise discovered your interest in the storytelling value of the father-daughter relationship if I hadn't shared this game with you and we hadn't talked about it the way a lot of people did, especially back in the day when games were physical first. And you might actually pass your disc copy of something like Nier to your buddy and say, hey, I know you haven't played this, I know we like the same kind of genre, you need to so we can talk about it. Which was kind of what we did with Nier. I mean, not even in terms of it being a genre like a JRPG, but we sort of spun up our own genre of like existential crisis games.
Let's be sad together?
Yeah, let's be sad together. Final Fantasy VII, Majora's Mask, Nier Gestalt. Let's have some crises about our place in the world and then talk about it and think about it. And the more that I reflected on genre in that sense, I think even with more established genres, the thing that has been useful for us is thinking about how we can make those genres our own as a way that is useful for our specific experiences and what it is that we're learning from each other out of these games, rather than arguing about the genre per se. So kicking it back to the Souls-like example, actually in a few PAXs over the past few years, we thought first about specifically the storytelling perspective of Hidetaka Miyazaki in his games such as Dark Souls and Bloodborne, and then asked the question, okay, if we're interested in this storyteller for these reasons, and then we look at these other games that might borrow something or another from his work, how does that comment on and change the nature of our experience with Miyazaki's work, and how do we feel about that, regardless of what particular media outlets might define or talk about regarding a Souls-like. And I know that as we did those panels, one thing that was really cool to me as we looked at these Souls-like games such as Code Vein or Hollow Knight or Nioh was that I wasn't just getting a better understanding of my experiences per se. When I heard, for instance, your experiences with Nioh, given the fact that you're a Japanese scholar and were able to think about all of the way it was using Japanese history to comment on and elaborate on some of the Souls-like storytelling techniques, it got me to go back to some of my experiences with these games and say, hey, even with the fictional worlds that are being spun out by Miyazaki and in Code Vein and things like that, if I take that kind of historical-minded perspective that you have, does that give me another way to think about the way that lore is used in an interactive sense in these games, which has been really rewarding for me.
Well, and I think that just as much as you got out of Nioh and kind of my breakdown of it, I got the same kind of breakdown out of Code Vein from your lens of philosophy and your knowledge of the Bandai Namco Tales series. Because looking at this game, looking at kind of what it means to play the role of a vampire and how we interact with these characters as the player and what that means, it just gave me a lot more insight into how I could read that game and games like it. And this brings me to a really fun thing that we do, which is in previous PAXs, we've also talked about series from this perspective, not just a single game. So we've talked about the many Final Fantasy VII games and how they all come together, as well as the Xenoblade Chronicles games. And so what's really cool about this is that it's not just, okay, let's look at a game through the lens of a JRPG. Let's look at multiple games that fall into the same series and see how that does it.
Yeah, and that's been really rewarding too as a way of platforming off of how we've been building these genres, because one thing that I know has felt sometimes isolating for me in doing this work, and I imagine some of you might be able to relate to if you get really deep into a series that you want to share with your friends, but they haven't always played all of the games, especially in long-running series like Final Fantasy or something like that. I've wanted to be able to share and think about stuff like what you've been doing with Pokémon and talk with you about what I've been doing in my Tales of Praxis series, looking at Bandai Namco's Tales games. And it hasn't always been super easy because we've been playing different games and looking at different series that say, in some ways, different things. But now that we have genre on our side and can think about how they contribute to a single sort of storytelling paradigm, at least we can start from a point of saying, all right, everything on this screen is clearly a JRPG, and so we can talk with each other even if we haven't played all of the same games about how it's shedding light on these broader tropes that we like to look at in these games.
Yeah. But okay.
Oh, did I go too fast for you?
No. I was following enough, but I think that I have an issue now because thinking about everything that you just said and thinking about JRPGs, I'm looking at these games and I don't know that JRPG actually necessarily encompasses what all of these series do.
Are you, like, you couldn't have told me this before I made up the slides?
I think we can work with it. So I think that when I'm looking at Final Fantasy VII, right? Like I definitely agree that there's a lot of JRPG tropes in that series.
Okay.
But this is also the series where you have the original game that is clearly an RPG, and then you have Dirge of Cerberus, which is a guy running around with a gun. So
look, I think you're getting a little caught up in the particular nuances of the different games in these series, which is missing the forest for the trees, right? The point of genre, like we were talking about, is that it's a way of architecting our interpretation and feelings about something that is large, like a sweeping series or a group of games. And then the nuances, it's not that they don't matter, but when we're talking about genre, they don't. They fluctuate and color the template that genre defines for us. I mean, you're not going to stand here and tell me that, you know, for all of its differences seemingly superficially from Final Fantasy, Pokemon at the end of the day isn't a JRPG, are you?
I think I might actually be saying that. I think I have a problem with labeling Pokemon, because I'm looking at all of them. I think there's definitely elements of the things that we're talking about, but it just feels like it's kind of doing something different or on its own in some way.
Okay, well look, I think we might be getting caught up in a little bit of what happens so often in games where we just kind of talk about our experiences in a broad and nebulous way that makes it harder for you to understand why you're wrong and why actually Pokemon is very much of a piece with the rest of these games.
Well, I want to be right.
Well, okay, I'll help you out. I'll help you figure out how to be right. I'm going to do you a favor. We've been talking in the abstract about all these different genres and things in our past experiences. Let's zoom in and I'll explain to you once and for all the ultimate unequivocal definition of a JRPG, because it's very clear that at the end of the day they all follow a singular unified rubric, and once I'm able to explain that to you, there'll be no doubt in your mind that Pokemon as a whole is a JRPG. Does that sound good?
I'm open to it.
Okay, good. Let's edify Dan, everyone. So, when we're thinking about genre or storytelling in general, it can be useful to think about the different elements of what a story is. Because then, if we're trying to define it as belonging to a certain genre, we can think of the genre as basically setting certain guardrails for the different elements of the story. To say, hey, if you want to be a JRPG, you have to play in this sandbox, and these are the limitations of the sandbox. So let's think about it in terms of the characters in these stories, the world that they inhabit, and the activities that both they and we as players engage with as we go through these stories. Thankfully, JRPGs have clear, obvious, changeless qualities that adhere to all three of these. If we're thinking about characters, yeah, there are many stories that just think about the journeys of an individual character. Maybe your favorite game has a singular avatar who's going through the world. JRPGs aren't like that at all. It's all about the party. It's about the relationships between relationships. So these characters aren't just coming to know one another, but they come to form a community and see their place in the world based on seeing how their relationship with one character informs their relationship with someone else, and you get this elaborate but mutually reinforcing network by the end of the game. What are they doing as they go through the world and form these relationships? Well, they're starting out just a small town girl living in a lonely world and slowly expanding their community until it consumes the entirety of the world. We see continents that we had never imagined By the time that we're at the end of the game, everything has been encountered in one way or another, but the great thing about JRPGs is it doesn't stop there. Every little stop along your way is like the tip of an iceberg, and you have the opportunity, given the interactivity of this medium, to decide what it is that interests you about the story or the world, and things that you would like to probe more deeply, and go into hours and hours and hundreds of hours sometimes of side content in order to enrich and embellish your experience with particular, more nuanced themes based on the side quests that you add to your particular venture through the game. And what is it at the end of the day that all of these activities are giving you insight into? This is one of my favorite things about JRPGs, and something that will never ever change no matter what JRPG you are looking at, Dan, is the fact that as you are going through and experiencing the world, you reach this kind of magical point of transcendence by the end of a JRPG, where you're not just thinking about a particular community or these mundane interests or even international conflicts between different warring kingdoms in the world. Eventually, the particularities of the world fall away, and you find yourself, as much as the characters, wrestling with more metaphysical questions, whether philosophical or spiritual, about things like, what is it to be a human? What is the right thing to do? What is the ethical way to orient ourselves in a world? Taken together, those give us that clear sandbox that poor Dan was not able to see before. But now, Dan, I have clearly sketched it for you, and I defy you to suggest that Pokemon lives in any sandbox besides this one.
I think here comes some defiance, because I think that it is very similar. I love the schema that you laid out here, but I think when I'm thinking of a Pokemon game, and especially the entire series, I think that there's some notable differences here. So relationship-driven storytelling, I agree, there is relationships in Pokemon, but the difference is more so about the relationship that the player has with the Pokemon team that they've created, right? And likewise with the world, I do think that there's an iceberg design, but it's less about kind of fleshing out these other side stories and more about unraveling a mystery that each game has to kind of deepen your understanding of the world that you're playing in. And then lastly, I think that there is definitely some metaphysical investigations, but to me it's more so clear-cut motivations that the villains have that are told from the off that they are, you know they're wrong. So there's not a whole lot of disambiguating happening there outside of, I think that I understand the philosophy that's being thrown at me here.
All right, well, look, I've tried to be generous to you, Dan, and we've already spent so much of these people's time with me trying to explain to you why you're wrong, so I'm going to go a step further. We've articulated the parameters of what a JRPG looks like in our ultimate definition that will never be challenged by anyone ever. But I think even though we've gotten more precise about that, there's a difference between thinking about genre in the abstract and seeing how it manifests in different ways in particular games. So I'm going to help you even further. I'll give you some examples from unequivocal, obvious JRPGs that everyone can agree with about how they manifest these different characteristics we're talking about, and then it'll be much easier for you to say, oh, okay, just like this, Pokemon does that, and Aaron was right, and we can go home and all be happy at the end of the day.
That sounds good.
Good, I think it sounds good. All right, let's start with thinking a little bit more about characters. And I've been living in Bandai Namco's Tales series since I was a wee boy. It was a big part of what inspired me to think about video games as a storytelling medium in the first place. And I've been going back to them lately, so I think they're good examples to use. Tales of Symphonia has always been my North Star for thinking about this kind of relationship-driven storytelling. Because in this JRPG, not only is it the case that you have a broad roster of characters with 9 different characters going into and out of your party over the course of the game, but it's also a quintessential Tales game and relationship-oriented game in the sense that while you are going on a journey to save the world, it's just as much a journey for these characters to get to know each other, oftentimes spending hours not connecting events that have to do with saving the world per se, but spending time just in conversations with one another. And the Tales series has a great actual mechanic for this, the skit mechanic, where you don't have to see these conversations, but the lion's share of the game happens with electing to see these little elaborate conversations about life, the universe, and everything, sometimes very serious, sometimes very funny, between these characters. So that by the end of the game, it's not just the case that Lloyd, the protagonist, has come to understand himself and his relationship with the world and what he wants to do to change it, but he's actually come to see how he sits networked with the individuals he spent the most time with differently by seeing, oh, it's not just that I've met, say, my biological father and I've gotten to know him, but actually I've gotten to meet a lot of people, and one of them, Regal, is very much like an older brother to me. And as I think about how my relationship with Regal informs my relationship with Kratos, my biological dad, it turns out that there's maybe more in common between them than Kratos and my surrogate dad. And as Lloyd comes to think about these different relationships, we come to understand the network of the party and what they mean to each other through a kind of arc that transcends individual character arcs. It is more about the development of this community, or the arc of a party, over the course of the story. And that's just categorically the case in any JRPG you're going to think of.
Well, I see where you're coming from, and I get that, especially for Tales games, but I think that Pokemon does something a little bit different. So, you mentioned Lloyd, right? Lloyd is this character who, one, has a name, and two, has a backstory that you can flesh out. But in Pokemon games, you're playing as this kind of nameless character that just is a blank slate into the world, right? So it's less about the relationships that you're seeing between the characters who are presented to you in a Tales game or a JRPG, and it's more about, all right, I have a goal, I have a dream, and I'm going to choose Pokemon to comprise my party. And while I think that you can definitely argue that all of the Pokemon that you choose and train are working towards the same goal that you have, they're not really, like, let me put it this way, I don't think Charizard and Lapras are talking to one another outside of the fights. They might be, but I've never seen it.
Maybe more people play the games if they were talking to each other outside the fights.
It might give a different dimension to it, but I think for the most part, it's a team that's working together towards a singular goal that you put into the world.
Okay, maybe that was a bad example. Maybe we're getting too hung up on characters. But the fact is, if we look at the setting, the world in which they are enacting these various stories, the world is going to operate in very similar ways that might help us to see the forest for the trees in terms of these different interactions between characters in the party, Pokemon or otherwise. Tales of Vesperia is a great example of this. We have another 9-person party. It's a boisterous, diverse group on a journey to save the world. But at the end of the day, especially in Vesperia, the journey that is longer than even your average Tales JRPG is not really so much about the saving of the world as it is these characters coming to understand who they are and how to support each other in individual interests and adventures that don't have that much unity across the entire 9-character party. And what's great about that is it's not so much intention as it is just representing a multidimensionality of this story, where yes, there is a singular unified path to save the world and it's something that they all believe in. But one of the coolest parts about this game is reaching the end of the story is less about that final confrontation and more about this whole manifold of side quests and side plots even opening up to you with these individual characters, where by the time you're able to face the final boss, you can also go back to all the other places in the world and take long, interesting looks into the individual characters that actually allow them, in many cases, to realize the conclusion of their arcs in ways that wouldn't be possible if you didn't have that interest in exploring them in more depth. For instance, one of my favorite examples of this right here on the screen is one of the very first characters who joins up with the party, this princess, Estelle. If you go back to one of the very first villages that you visited when you set off on this journey and left the seat of the empire, she actually comes to understand not just the history of that town, but kind of a misunderstanding of the history that has led children to be afraid of this kind of misunderstood ghost who is not really a ghost at all. And she has this realization that based on her character and a lot of what she's been through in the main story, she can help this town and community by telling a different story about that spirit, which gives her a real insight and an outcome that wouldn't otherwise be available or happen in the game, saying, hey, I thought I was, a princess who left the castle and was maybe going to go back and tend to the empire after this, but actually I want to stay here in Halor, in this town, and be a writer, a storyteller, and do this, because this makes more sense to me. And that kind of empowerment through interested engagement with the story is one of the things that I love about JRPGs. It keeps calling me back to them because it feels like it honors my interest in all of the different threads in whatever form I want to make it take in that game. And I gotta tell you, I can't see a world in which Pokemon doesn't follow that exact same structure.
I can. So I think that I love all of that because, again, I resonate with so much of that so well. And I love the idea of kind of exploring these side content, these side stories to flesh out the characters' motivations, their thematics, all of this great stuff that makes us love JRPGs. But when I think about Pokemon, I do think that there's an element of mystery, but it's kind of like over here a lot of the time. And one of the cool things about Pokemon is that it doesn't really affect the plot if we look at the plot as, I want to become stronger, I want to be the best like no one ever was. That's a very concrete goal, especially in those early Pokemon games. So speaking of, you take a look at Pokemon Red and Blue, there's this great kind of mystery that's just sort of sprinkled in about this ancient and legendary Pokemon Mew that we come to find out through horrifying genetic experiments created this thing called Mewtwo. and you can encounter it, and you can add it to your party, but the important thing to note here is that that's only kind of orthogonal to what you're actually trying to do in the goal of the game, right? It's fun, it's interesting, but it's not like, I still understand myself if I don't catch Mewtwo, is my point.
Okay, well let's step back. Let's talk about the goal, okay? Because I get that maybe these other elements and parts of the sandbox, they might be too flexible to locate in a really precise and immutable way, even though I've done so, but I'll give you that point. When you look at the broader themes and the insights that these games lead you to, whether it's the goal of Pokemon or the goal of something like Tales of the Abyss, it's going to take a very similar and inspiring shape. And it's one of the things that I love most about JRPGs, this idea that maybe people who don't play JRPGs and feel on the outside of it don't get this, because the worlds can seem really fantastical and unbelievable and bear no relation to the real world. But the magical, super cool thing about JRPGs is you can go on these long fantasy adventures, and based on the way you progress through them, at the end of the day, you'll arrive at insights and moments of contemplation that are just as directly relatable to the real world and your place in it as it is to these fantasy worlds, which then gives you an opportunity to treat the entire journey you've been on as a kind of metaphor or symbolic experience to recodify your experiences and the path that you want to chart in the real world. Tales of the Abyss is a fantastic example of this, because the arcs that you journey through in what you might think of as the various acts of the story go from a small community, pretty much the smallest community you can imagine, where the protagonist, Luke, is just holed up for reasons he doesn't understand in his family's manor, to gradually going throughout the world and learning not just about the communities and different kingdoms that populate this world, but also what that means in terms of social and moral responsibility for Luke as someone who needs to develop into a fully realized human in more ways than one, but that's beside the point for this. To ultimately not just coming to understand the international stage and how to participate as a responsible citizen, but in fact to think about these more metaphysical, not having to do with the particulars of the world, problems that we're all going to have to wrestle with one way or another in real life, whether we like it or not. Questions like, what the heck is it to be a person? What is the right thing to do? How do I define a purpose in my life, and what does that purpose even mean? Is it just a goal that someone else gives me? Is it something that I'm able to responsibly shape for myself? And if so, how can I shape the world in a way that is ethically better for everyone? Importantly, and in a really cool way for JRPGs, including the antagonist. Of course it's going to be a story, of course you wrestle back and forth, and there's a big boss you have to beat in the end. But a really cool thing about JRPGs is by the time you hit that final boss, whether it's the stereotype of fighting God, or it's someone like Vantastelka Grants in Tales of the Abyss, who starts out as Luke's teacher only to betray him. The cool turn at the end of the game that so illustrates this point is that really at the end of the day, Van is still kind of a teacher for Luke. They have to fight him, they have to defeat his plan, but the path that he has sent the party on and engaged them with throughout the game is exactly what teaches them what needs to be done in the world, and why Luke actually, after defeating him, instead of saying something like, "You get what you fucking deserve," says, "Master Van, thank you." And that is just such a cool way to think about not just story and narrative progression, but really personal development as a mode of turning conflict into something positive for everyone. That's going to be in every JRPG, dude. You're not going to tell me you don't feel empowered in that exact way every time you finish a Pokemon game. You've told me you have.
Yeah, I have. But I think also, jokes come in threes, and here we are. So I think that I love everything that you just said, because I agree, JRPGs are full of these kind of questions, this ambiguity, right? A lot of the best JRPGs work in the gray, but I think that Pokemon works much more in black and white. And that's because we have a ton of these villains here that are presented to us, like the ones I have up here, Giovanni, Archie, Cyrus, just to name a few, who have these very clear-cut motivations that we understand to be wrong because of the way that the game sets it up. So it's not so much, okay, am I going to look into this guy's plan and maybe be swayed by his thinking? It's much more, I understand this person to be wrong, and I'm going to defeat them to prove that what I am doing, the opposite of it, is right. So it's much less about this kind of ambiguity, and the funny thing too is that I would flip it and say that if anybody's going to be thanking anyone at the end of a Pokemon game, it's going to be a character like Cyrus or Archie thanking the player to say, thanks for snapping me out of it.
Dude, I gotta tell you, I love you, you're my oldest friend, you're my best friend, but I feel like you're my Pokemon antagonist right now. We're talking at cross purposes. And I'm kind of trying not to lose my mind, because it's not even as if you've said that Pokemon doesn't have these elements that I've sketched out in terms of the various parts of its story. It's like you're just trying to answer the question at a different level, saying that there's some way in which they, I don't know, they do something with their story that's just not adequately captured by the notion of what a JRPG is. So I'm honestly a little exhausted right now. I think it's going to be better if you just explain to me what the hell it is you mean by this thing that Pokemon does, and maybe then we can see if there's anything to salvage from our idea of genre when push comes to shove.
Absolutely. Well, I think that this is everything that we've been thinking about, all of the questions that we've been asking and the problems that we've been running into are problems that I ran into when I played Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. Because for those of us who have played it, we understand that at the end of it, there's this kind of rug pull moment where things are really changed for us in a way that shows us that these characters, Professor Turo and Professor Sada, respectively, in each of their games, has something that they are so insistent upon. It's so insistent upon. It's their dream, their dream, their dream, their dream. They keep saying this. And so when I ask myself, okay, there's something about Pokemon that feels different. It's been with me my whole life. I was 5 or 6 when it first came out. It's been coming out since then. And I've been engaging with it kind of off and on my entire life. And why is that? What about it is so special that makes me keep wanting to come back? And to get to that answer, I had to ask the question, okay, let's get really simple. What is Pokemon about, right? And I think that you can have a lot of lowercase, what is Pokemon about? Like, it's about catching Pokemon and things like this, but what is it trying to say as a story? And I kept coming back to this idea of dreams, and the question, what is a dream, and how do we look at them? So I'm going to take you back through my journey through playing these games for my series Pokemon Rose. I've been looking back at all of them in order, and I've been trying to find out what it is that they're trying to say about dreams. And you can see super early on, there's this persistent theming of dreams that keeps popping up. Professor Oak in Pokemon Red and Blue, he's your entree into the world. He's the one who explains what Pokemon are. He lets you know sort of what your journey looks like. And one of the first things he says to us is, my dream was to fill out the Pokedex. So he's colored our journey with his own dream, saying, I can't do it anymore, I'm too old. So on your journey, I would really appreciate it if you could help me achieve my dream, right? So this is kind of where it comes in. But then we have another question that we have to ask, which is, okay, well, what is a dream, right? So here we see our first rival, Blue or Gary, depending on how you look at it. Seen here being very respectful to his grandfather. He has a very clear dream as well, and that dream is to be unquestionably the strongest Pokemon trainer in the world, and he's completely kind of blinded by this goal. But we find that it's not really a goal, right? It's not as simple as a goal or an ambition. It is an all-encompassing thing for him. It is a dream. I want to do this, just like his grandfather wants to complete the Pokedex. And I think that while that is really powerful, what I find to be more powerful in the next question I asked was, okay, well, we have a dream, so what? What does that do? Well, if we look at this character from Ruby and Sapphire, we see that it's something that can really drive us to be a better person. So this character is set up to be basically the same as that first rival in Red and Blue. He wants to be stronger, but for different reasons. He wants to be stronger so that he can stand on his own 2 feet. And as he follows his dream, and he kind of situates himself against you, the player, he achieves it. He gets stronger, and he gets more confident, to the point where he actually meets you at the end of the game for one last battle. It's a really touching thing. But Pokemon is not content to just be kind of nice and touchy-feely, because we see that dreams can also corrupt. When we're completely and utterly obsessed with a dream, we can definitely cause issues for the world around us. For those of you not familiar with the cosmology of Pokemon, this guy is summoning the devil to enact his dream, which coincidentally is kind of explained as, my dream is to rid people of their ambition and their goals, because I believe that that taints the universe, right? So Cyrus is very antithetical to what Pokemon is doing. But it doesn't stop there either, because we come full circle to Professor Turo or Professor Sada, the kind of twist antagonist at the end of Scarlet and Violet. So we've come from a Pokemon professor saying how lovely it would be for you to help me on my dream, to a professor like Turo being completely and utterly consumed with this idea of what he is trying to do, to the point where we find out this isn't even Turo, this is just kind of a representation of this insane dream that he has. We find that he's foregone his family, he's forsaken familial relationships. We see how that's affected the character Arvin in the game. We see also that it's not just his personal relationships that he's destroying, but really the fabric of the world. And so he is so obsessed and so consumed by this that we see that through Scarlet and Violet, in particular this character, dreams have the potential not just to be nice, fun things that we can engage with, but truly dangerous, truly scary things that we need to reckon with to make sure we don't follow the same path.
Okay, so I think I'm starting to understand why I was losing my mind before. And I think I could figure out how to square this. So it feels like what you're saying is, fine, all right, we can say that Pokemon has these elements that are consistent with a JRPG, but there's a difference between the structural elements that a game has in terms of its storytelling and gameplay and everything else.
If I may, what it's really doing is it's setting itself up as a vehicle through which we can explore these ideas.
Okay, that's helpful. So yes, games can have the same elements, but if we think about it as a vehicle or a mechanism for players to contemplate or have different experiences, I do understand now, much better than I did before, how Pokemon could be that kind of vehicle for contemplating and realizing your dreams in the real world. And it does feel like maybe it's not so much a question of whether Pokemon is a JRPG, but it's almost as if that question misses the point in terms of what it is that it is uniquely allowing players to do.
How is it taking the ideas of a JRPG and using those ideas through the language of its own series?
All well and good, but man, I gotta make trouble for this now, because I'm going back to the way that we started this, thinking about genre and games that we were much more willing to say, yes, these are obviously similar because they're JRPGs, stuff like Final Fantasy and Tales. And if we have now this other layer of thinking about what it is that games are trying to do with their storytelling in terms of the vehicle to which they put the use of these various elements, can we do the same thing for other JRPG series as you just did for Pokemon?
I say we try it. Let's, okay, so we're talking about Final Fantasy and Tales.
Right.
So let's take both of those and see if we can talk about them through the language of their series.
Okay, and I guess this can be a useful exercise, and maybe even the perfect place to test our intuitions about this, because it's not even just that these games are JRPGs, right? We have an opportunity to think about Final Fantasy 16, that big thing that just came out with that fire monster some of you may be familiar with, who I hear is hanging out here at PAX, and this other game, Tales of Arise, the most recent mothership entry in Bandai Namco's Tales series. And while they are both JRPGs, and I think it's fair to assume the unified agreement of anything if we assume that they're both JRPGs. I doubt we'll get much disagreement there. But they share a lot of structural elements even beyond the very generic things that I was talking about earlier. And so if they do diverge and we have the intuition that they say different things, it'll be interesting to use this vehicle series-oriented analysis to see if that can tell us why it's the case. If we look at the plots, just to set up how similar these games are, it's not just that they're JRPGs, it's also that they're both considering what it is to free enslaved populations, whether those are magic users or Danans who have been oppressed by Renans, and to figure out how to recapture your will to do anything in a world that has sapped that away from you. Not only that, but the protagonist in each game is a sort of exiled royal figure where that royal status is not so much what you initially take it to be, but is really a kind of codename or moniker for their role in the grand plot of some antagonist working behind the scenes in order to use the subjugation of the entire world for a nefarious scheme of its own ends. But it's not even the general strokes of the plot. Like, the more I'm thinking about this, it's kind of uncanny. Like, they have very similar character types as well. In each game, we get a much more articulately consummated love story than we might expect if we just go into a JRPG. We have Clive and Jill saying to each other aloud, "I love you." We have Alphen and Chio actually getting married at the end of Tales of Arise. We have these surrogate father figures who teach our heroes how to rise up and what it means to resist before falling in battle and leaving this legacy for them to carry on and fulfill. And even within the party dynamics. In a world where one class seems to be subjugating the other, we have particular character studies of individuals who break that mold and challenge those stereotypes, whether that's Jill as a dominant who falls in love with Clive, or indeed Dohalim, a Renan lord who decides that the crown contest and this mode of oppression that Rena is imposing on Dana is not right, and that he wants to resist and actually join the party in the fight. And of course, even if you look at the equipment, there are a lot of similarities.
Pretty obvious, yeah.
It seems to be saying that between these two games, they're not just JRPGs, but for all we've said, it might really be considered two faces of the same story. This kind of study in what it means to galvanize your will and then figure out how to be the final arbiter of the meaning that you're enacting in a world that's always trying to seize that away from you. But for all that, it does seem to me, and I imagine probably to you too, that there is a difference between these. And especially if we're familiar with the two series, like we are, it's kind of uncanny how different they can be for being so similar. And so maybe this series study can help us out.
Because the kind of question we come to, right, is that for all the similarities that you just lined up with these two games, I think we can all agree they're not the same game, right? There's something else going on here. So I would say that the next step would actually be going through, kind of similar to what I did with Pokemon, and taking a look at the language of these series to see how they are different, how they do different, how we can really learn a lot from that.
I like that. So how about this? You know, I've been living in what's the tortured way to do this metaphor? Living in a Mako bath of Tales games for the last little while, doing all of these things for Tales of Praxis, my series.
And I love Final Fantasy.
And you are terminally obsessed with Final Fantasy. So why don't you give us a series-oriented reading of what it is that Final Fantasy 16 is up to? I'll do the same with the Rise, and we'll see if we can disambiguate them using this language of Pokemon that you were talking about.
Let's do it. So I'm going to start from the same place that I started with the Pokemon question, which is, what is Final Fantasy about? And I don't mean what is any particular entry about, right? But what is the series about? What is it trying to say? What are the persistent themes that come up over and over again? And when I ask myself this question, looking at all of the different Final Fantasy titles, I find that the question that Final Fantasy is asking is answered by this thought of, they are about self-actualization through fighting fate. This huge force that seems inestimable and something that cannot be overcome is routinely overcome through different means in the Final Fantasy series. So I want to look at that in three different ways with these three games in particular. Now, not to say that this doesn't show up in the other games, but for the sake of argument, I'm going to look at these three. So Final Fantasy VI poses fate as this cruel, capricious, and arbitrary force in the universe. Then Final Fantasy X comes along and says, you know what, even though it can be cruel and it can be harmful, it's not something that can never be questioned or something that is set in stone. And Final Fantasy XVI, the most recent entry, comes along and says, the idea of fate, this thing that we're fighting against, can truly only be overcome when we accept certain things and we become a broader, better person. So I want to look at these kind of one by one. So take Final Fantasy VI, for example. I think that fate is represented through the chaotic Kefka. So if anybody has played Final Fantasy VI, you will agree with me that he is cruel and unyielding. He's a very rough character. So what's beautiful about this, though, is that that doesn't mean that he's unstoppable. The party members use the same force of magic that Kefka used to become this unstoppable, cruel thing, and use it against him through optimism, through hoping for a better future, and through ultimately helping each other out. They can overcome fate, as personified by Kefka. Then we have Final Fantasy X. Final Fantasy X comes around and basically situates fate as a story. Fate is a story that we are just kind of along for the ride on, and it's not something that we can change. But then characters like Auron come around and say, well, hang on a minute. If fate is a story, you're a character in that story, and who's to say you don't have the agency to rewrite it however the hell you want? You are not bound by fate. You can change it if you like. And so we see this idea of getting over it by taking the power back. And Final Fantasy XVI comes along and really says the quiet part out loud, because Final Fantasy XVI basically says that fate is a prison to which we are all prisoners. There's no escaping it. And yet, we see characters like Clive come around and say, well, I'm only as much a prisoner as I'm willing to be bound by these shackles you have put on me. And the way that I can throw them away is by recognizing my faults, accepting the truth of myself, and then using that agency to fight back against fate. So in real terms, the truth will set us free at the end of Final Fantasy XVI. So that's how I would read the language of Final Fantasy.
And I feel like, honestly, you've made my job easy, because as much as I was setting up the similarities and really struggling with how, seen in a certain light, Final Fantasy XVI and Tales of Arise can seem like mirrored images of each other, you're articulating the way that Final Fantasy functions as a vehicle for contemplating and overcoming fate really helps to make stark the key difference for me, I think, because when it comes down to how I read and think about these Tales games, I feel like it's almost night and day, where fate typically doesn't enter into the equation. You look at these games, and they're much more of a kind of, I guess you might say, like an anthropological study of how the history of the world has come to create the present, not through fate or some kind of destiny, but through sometimes very complicated choices that individuals have made, and sometimes even natural events that have occurred. And so as we're able to uncover more about the past of the world, we're able to become more reflective, holistically informed beings to decide in a way that's not just good for us, but good for everyone, what sort of future do we want to chart. And I think that's really helpful for me in getting into the differences through the final bosses. I love to think about final bosses in general for the reasons that I was talking about with the trajectory of JRPG storytelling. I feel like they oftentimes say a lot about the ultimate themes that the games are trying to get you to consider. And for all I said before about these antagonists similarly pulling the strings from behind the scenes in these complicated cosmic operas of world subjugation, they're pretty different beings. Ultima, the monster at the end of the book in Final Fantasy XVI, and the great astral spirit of Rena at the end of, basically the end and beginning of creation in Tales of Arise. Because, for all of their similarities, Ultima is very much like an evil, wicked person who is scheming this complicated, rational, means-end plan in order to co-opt all of the machinery of the world for the sake of the propagation of his species. Whereas the great astral spirit of Rena is something primordial. It's not rational. It's this feeling, a desire that then infects individual actors who create schemes to bring about what it wants in sometimes very convoluted, always misguided ways. It's one thing to observe that, though, and we still have to do the work of figuring out, well, what does that mean for Tales of Arise? It's pretty clear by virtue of what you said that Ultima is this kind of imposed fate that needs to be overcome. But what about Tales of Arise? How can we think about this great astral spirit of Rena in a way that reinforces this kind of anthropological reflection on how we got to be where we are and what it is we're doing next? Well, I think in the spirit of the comparisons that you were doing with the Final Fantasy reading, and in terms of this kind of analytical, reflective process that I see come up in the Tales games over and over again, I want to try to run a reading of Tales of Arise with this kind of stepwise process for thinking about how its story takes us not just through different acts, but in fact through different ways of looking at the world that we can see embodied through different Tales games. In fact, the same ones that I was talking about earlier at the start of this panel, so that by the time we arrive at the conclusion, we're able to do something that I would say is pretty uniquely empowering, and something that is very different from the kind of empowerment we get at the end of Final Fantasy XVI. So we start out this game in a world of subjugation. The world of Dana has been ruled by Renans for 300 years, to the point that the people living there really don't even have a sense of what it is to act for themselves, let alone rise up. And this is tragically true in the real world too, right? If you're enslaved in one way or another for long enough, it just becomes a fact of life, and you don't even really know whom to point to in order to resist and overcome it. It feels nebulous. Well, how do you figure out how to get your will back? You look at the lessons from Tales of Symphonia. Tales of Symphonia is this kind of world where if something is wrong, it is because someone did something in the past, and it is up to you to figure out who it was that did that, why they did it, and what the right way to hold them accountable is. World is split in two? Well, that's because a specific guy, Mythos Yggdrasil, did that. And guess who the boss at the end of the game is? It's Mythos. And you have to figure out how to adjudicate that, judge him, and create a new world. Just so, rising up in Tales of Arise consists in recognizing that there are these specific entities, Renans and ultimately the Helganquil, that are responsible for imposing this world order upon the Danans. And once Danans recognize this, they're able to resist and fight back against specific individuals in their communities to change things. But Tales of Arise would have us believe you can't stop there, because if you take that as the last step, that hatred and resistance is just going to fester and perpetuate the same cycle, as we actually see in some Danans who overthrow their Renan oppressors just to become equally hateful and cause their own downfall. At the end of the day, it turns out, even if there are individual actors who are responsible for the ills in the world, if we ask what it is that brought them to these actions in the first place, sometimes that chain of reasoning and blame bottoms out in something that is no one's fault. And Tales of Vesperia is a great way for modeling this. The whole struggle in which the game culminates is this idea that the natural order of the world and the way things were is wrong and not ideal for everyone. It's a world that, for want of a better term, kind of has a built-in kill switch, this delightfully eldritch thing you see there, the Autophagos, to wipe out humanity and consume a whole lot of the world if they end up using too much magic for the betterment of their society. And so the party ends up having to wrestle with the idea of, given that the world order is not ideal, how can we change the world in a way that will make it better for everyone? Just so in Tales of Arise, even though these Renans and Helgample initially seem to be these enforcers of this manipulative and arbitrary world order, we ultimately find out that they're really just kind of accepting the influence of this primordial feeling that I talked about, this great astral spirit of Rena. It doesn't bottom out in someone like Mythos, it bottoms out in something much more like the Autophagos. Even the thorns that cause Shion so much pain are just a manifestation of this cosmic feeling that the world is not as it should be. Energy is partitioned between Dana and Rena in a way that is not helpful and in a way that causes this tension that is always going to try to be explained by the actors in the world and rationalized through unhealthy systems like the system of subjugation that has been enacted at the beginning of the game. All well and good, but then the question remains, how do you actually figure out how to change the world, especially if there's not someone you can put on trial for this? Well, Tales of the Abyss, and I think really the finale of Tales of Arise, have an answer here. If the world is expressing that things are not in order, you have to listen to the world in a non-rational way in order to rectify that. And I don't think that means non-rational in the sense of, oh, let's be irrational. I mean non-rational in the sense that mystic traditions would have us believe. This idea that there are certain ways of relating to the world and identifying the location of our spirit in it as part of a broader, unified whole that allows us to resonate with each other in ways that are not adequately captured by intellect, but are the kinds of things that we try to access through meditation. Or if you're in a JRPG, like Tales of the Abyss, by resonating with this collected consciousness that manifests particular energies from the world and is like a literal representation of the world sense of its own history, known as Lorelei in the game. Just so, by the time we actually reach the great astral spirit of Rena in Tales of Arise, this thing that has putatively caused so much pain, even though it doesn't seem to be the right kind of thing to hold responsible, it's up to the Danon mage, Rinwell, to commune with it and say, no, it's not rationalizing in the way that something like Ultima would be in Final Fantasy XVI. It's this pure, unfiltered feeling, a recognition that even though no one made the world the way it is, the world was made in a way that is wrong, and we need to figure out how to rebalance it. And that's exactly what puts us in a position to do that rebalancing, that cosmic rectification at the end of the game, that really has nothing to do with fighting and overcoming fate. In fact, actually, as I'm thinking about it more, the perspective of fighting against one's fate and resisting is almost shown to be the wrong perspective in this final conclusion, because the foil to Alphen, this other sovereign that was a pawn in Rena's plan, is this crazy, broken man called Volron, who basically tries to do the same thing that the party is doing at the end of the day, but for the wrong reasons. He says, I've been made a pawn by the universe. They said that I had this special power of the sovereign, but it didn't mean anything. It was a facade. I'm going to kill the Great Spirit and show them that I'm that strong for real. So even though he's resisting in this way that actually reinforces the roles that were put upon him and the order of the world that's been rationally but incorrectly constructed from the sentiments of the cosmos itself. Instead, what we are able to do is something that is much better, beautifully, I would say, represented in the ultimate harmony and marriage between Shion and Alphen, these people who were brought together by contingent aspects of their characters and the roles that they played in this cosmic drama. Shion having these thorns, Alphen having this mask put upon him that made him numb, and so they were kind of these two puzzle pieces that had no choice but to get together. But by the end of the day, as they reconfigure their place in the world, they're also able to put that to the side and recognize and see each other as individuals and simply people on their own terms, regardless of whatever incidental factors might have brought them together in the first place. And just so, in a kind of delightfully esoteric and fairy tales ending, the very kind of outcome for the world that might have seemed like the bad ending without this path to a different understanding becomes a beautiful way to heal the world. Yes, the great spirit of Reno was trying to subsume Dana and absorb its energy in order to rebalance the nature of the cosmos. But at the end, we're able to do this kind of reharmonization and fusion of the two worlds, not in the sense of one consuming the other, but in the sense of all the spirits and individuals within the world as literally represented in the other great astral spirit, that of Dana, to unify the world by this kind of super-rational election, rather than just giving in to the rationalizations of the great spirit of Rena's plan. That's really touching, and I think just a kind of remarkably rich spiritual insight that we can port over to our lives more broadly. And to the point that we were wrestling with at the beginning of all this, it really doesn't have much to do with fate at all. Not to say that these aren't JRPGs, but I think it has allowed us a way back to figuring out, for all that they have in common, what is it that they say on their own terms that's only possible in the context of that series. I think you've successfully helped me dissolve my confusions, Dan. But I don't think that we could close and do justice to ourselves or to this fine audience without going back to where we began. Because for all we've seen looking into these series, we started out with this idea that genre can be something useful for making sense of this deluge of games that we're playing and trying to make sense of ourselves, but also be able to share with others who have their own lists of games. And now it might seem as if we've arrived at this idea that genre is not all that helpful because we just have to look at series as individual objects. So what's the lesson here? Do we need to throw out genre, or else what is it good for?
Well, my next line is no.
Okay.
We don't have to throw it away, because what we can do instead is exactly what we did here today, where we started from this question of genre. What is it? How do we use it? How do we talk about it? And then that evolved into this idea of reading through series, finding the language of a series and how that's communicating with these genre tropes that we were talking about. So you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, I'm not going to talk about genre ever again. Because we had a lot of fun today, kind of starting from that place and seeing where it went with the language of these games that we love so much. And I would say that in both of our experiences of taking that and doing that, we've gotten such a deeper appreciation for these series that we've already loved so much. So I would actually say for everybody in this audience today, think about a game that has it's a long-running series, right? It doesn't have to be a JRPG, but maybe it is. Kingdom Hearts, it could be Persona, it could be, you know, tactical espionage with Metal Gear, right? You can look at these things and start from the idea of the genre and then say, but what is this game series really trying to say? And you have this really fun Ouroboros of trying to figure things out.
You're trying to bait me into talking about Xenoblade Chronicles for another hour, because you know I could do that. But no, I think starting point is a great button on which to end, and a useful thing to dwell on for one more moment, because I think there's this sense in which we can hear, oh yeah, genre as a starting point as something pejorative, like it only gets you so far. But oh my goodness, there was a real sense in which we started this with confusion about what is the right way into putting these series and games in conversation with each other at all. And I think that's very common, especially in a world where we're getting so many games all the time and playing through them and maybe feeling rushed to get on to the next release and finish up whatever we're playing in a timely manner. And sometimes we can just be so awash in that Mako bath of experiences that it can be difficult to make sense of the right framework to use to have a singular coherent view of what we took out of that game, let alone what it's saying relative to another game. And so I think I'm grateful that we were able to have genre as a tool in this regard, because without that as a point for starting these conversations, we really wouldn't have arrived at any of these thoughts about Pokemon or Tales or Final Fantasy or any of the other series that we might want to think about this with. So with that, my dear friends, I want to thank you for helping us figure our heads out about this. Hopefully you enjoyed yourselves too. We love doing this. We love thinking about the storytelling of these games. But more than anything, we love just having these conversations with like-minded gamers about why the storytelling language of this medium is so potent and impactful and deeply experiential in ways that don't just give us a new light into our own identity, but a new light into being able to share ourselves with others. We love that. If you want to check out more, we exist online in so many forms. We're also happy, as we said, to keep the conversation going after this. But until then, think well, game well, have a great rest of your PAX. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
See you next time.